Making a great game today is incredibly hard. Even experienced developers with huge budgets don't always pull it off. So today I wanna talk about the top 5 biggest RTS flops in gaming history. Just to be clear, I'm only talking today about major releases from well-known studios with real budgets, not random skibidi cash grabs or meme projects that 50 people played. And let's start with Universe at War, a strategy game that came out at the end of 2007 and actually had a huge chance to succeed, and I personally like that, to be honest. It was made by Petroglyph Games, the studio that gave us phenomenal Star Wars Empire at War. The game revolves around a terrifying alien invasion on Earth, and as the story goes on, other factions join the fight, some trying to save the planet, others trying to destroy it. The core gameplay used standard RTS mechanics, gathering resources, building bases and units, and of course fighting your opponents. But the real highlight of that game was the hierarchy faction. Almost every unit was a massive war walker that leveled everything in its path, instantly grabbing your attention and even giving off War of the Worlds vibes. The other factions were creative too, inspired by ancient civilizations, and there was also a human faction, but it was only campaign only and it was not playable in multiplayer. Overall, Universe at War was not a bad strategy game. It had plenty of strong points, but context of course matters, because outside of a couple of neat mechanics and some cool faction concepts, the game didn't really bring much new to the table. The campaign story was generic and many of the missions felt pretty dull. Compared to all other games in this list that we'll be talking about, this game feels actually quite good, and it's really sad that it didn't perform that well. For Petroglyph, it was a real disappointment. After the massive success of Empire at War, fans expected another hit, but it never happened, even though the game honestly had a lot of fresh ideas. And again, the problem was that the game launched at the end of 2007, right in the golden era of RTS games. Between 2006 and 2008, we got Company of Heroes and its expansions, Command & Conquer 3, Red Alert 3, Supreme Commander, and many more games. The competition was insane, and Universe at War just simply couldn't keep up. The studio had big plans for building a whole new universe and sequels to this game, but all of that had to be scrapped, and the game wasn't really a big commercial success. In fourth place, I would put Grey Goo, another Petroglyph title, and another attempt to re-enter the RTS market and recapture that Empire at War magic. Unfortunately, Grey Goo ran into even more issues than anyone expected. At first glance, it actually looked quite promising. 3 factions at launch, and a 4th was added later. There were solid graphics, a full story campaign with cutscenes, and plenty of original ideas. It was a classic RTS game with base building and resource gathering, and the most unique race was the Grey Goo itself. It didn't have a base, and instead everything came from the main structure, which could move around the map and pressure every opponent on the map. It was pretty cool, the race was super aggressive, and it was fun to play in multiplayer. So in general, on the surface, the game looked like it had everything that RTS fans ever wanted. It had diverse factions, interesting units, and a story people actually even praised. But the game crashed and burned almost immediately after release. The main issue was the gameplay. Grey Goo was slow, it was even sluggish. The battles felt dull, with almost no sense of impact when units were fighting, and as a player, you never really felt the weight of the epic scale of the combat, which is a very bad thing for a sci-fi inspired game. The maps were small, and the whole thing just lacked any real sense of scope. The real tragedy is that Grey Goo just didn't stand out in any way, which is ironic given its name. Everything about it was technically well made, and you could see that developers actually put a lot of effort into this game. Unfortunately, the pieces just didn't come together into something memorable. It felt boring, it felt dull, and just inferior to the great RTS games that came before. It didn't have the fast-paced micro, high battles, sharp unit control that you get in StarCraft 2, you don't really get that adrenaline rush in this game, but it also didn't offer the deep base building and interesting economy gameplay as it is in Age of Empires series. The game simply wasn't special enough to make players switch to it. And to make things worse, StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void also dropped in 2015 and just completely stole the spotlight. And if you ask gamers today about Grey Goo, most do not even remember it, much less its story or its campaign, and it quickly turned into abandonware. And that's a shame, because Again, it's yet another example of how, without a truly great idea, even a well-made game can completely lose its appeal to a wider audience. In third place, I would put Warhammer 40k Dawn of War 3. This was one of the saddest releases in the history of the genre. In short, the main issue with the entire Dawn of War series was the ongoing simplification of its core mechanics in favor of a more casual experience. From a fully fledged RTS game, we got into something completely different. With each new installment, base building and resource management became simpler and simpler, and the third game, they finally decided to simplify the gameplay itself. MOBA-style elements were added, the game became faster, units died way too quickly, and the biggest complaint from players was that Dawn of War 3 didn't feel like a relic game anymore, and it even didn't feel like Dawn of War at all. The focus shifted towards competitive multiplayer instead of the areas that fans actually cared about, like single-player campaign, like immersion, and so on. At release, Dawn of War 3 was lacking in pretty much everything: map count, playable factions, and some other gameplay features. The single-player campaign was linear and not really very engaging compared to previous installments, and the extremely fast time to kill made multiplayer more frustrating for fans that were used to something different. Players also missed the iconic Warhammer atmosphere, the voice lines, the sync kills, and just all that stuff that made the original Dawn of War special. Even the visuals took a hit, and the grimdark vibe was replaced with a cartoony look that didn't even fit the universe at all. Even the protagonist on the poster looked like he walked out straight off Clash of Clans or some other mobile cash grab. In short, it was a full-scale downgrade for the series. And while Dawn of War 3 was still good in some aspects and it still tried to innovate in a few areas, in most ways it was still worse than its predecessors. Still, some players hoped that the game would improve over time with patches and DLCs, but that never happened. The backlash was so bad that just 10 months after release, the devs announced that they will stop any active development, keeping only server support. No new content, no fixes, and the game was left to sink, and today it's remembered as one of the worst Warhammer 40k games ever made. In second place, I would put Stormgate, and this was the biggest RTS flop of the last decade. And what makes it especially depressing is that out of all RTS releases in the past 10 years, Stormgate was the only one that actually had a real shot at becoming a great AAA strategy game. It had a massive budget, a huge amount of trust from StarCraft 2 fans, plus non-stop support from every StarCraft 2 creator. It felt like everything was just perfectly aligned for the success of this game, but Stormgate turned into yet another story of poor financial management. The project was simply way too ambitious. They wanted to create the world's first social RTS with tons of different modes, but they also wanted a top-tier competitive esports 1v1 mode, then they wanted a robust modding scene, and of course a full-on single-player campaign, but also co-op and maybe even map editor, basically everything at once, and the project just tore itself apart. By release, it turned out that all of those things were just false promises, and Frost Giant had literally one thing in working condition. It was the versus mode. Everything else was raw, unfinished, or enjoyable only to a tiny number of players who were consuming insane amount of copium from Reddit and other platforms where Stormgate was still praised. The daily player count barely reached 100 or maybe sometimes 200 people. The game just felt inferior and weak, and while, to be fair, versus mode was actually pretty good, the game just fell short of StarCraft 2 in almost every meaningful category, and StarCraft 2 was the game that they actually planned to replace with Stormgate. One of the main points of criticism was again the visual style. Stormgate looked cheap and cartoony, especially for the first year after it made it into early launch, and the game just lacked any real sense of beauty or identity. Some faction designs, like the Celestials, felt extremely unfinished and dull. But what made everything even worse were the developers themselves, the scandals, fake positive reviews, arguments with critics on LinkedIn, and all of that just destroyed the studio's already fragile public image after unsuccessful early release. The dreams of the devs and the community simply never came true, which is a very sad story, but it is what it is. Stormgate ended up being one of the weakest, most unfinished RTS releases in modern gaming. And in first place, Command & Conquer 4 Tiberium Twilight. Even though this game was actually more polished and technically more complete than Stormgate, the damage it did to the series was absolutely massive. Back in 2010, CNC as a franchise was trying to reinvent itself. The RTS genre was already declining and the developers were experimenting with new formats. At the same time, MOBAs like Dota and League of Legends were exploding in popularity, so CNC4 borrowed heavily from those ideas, and as a result, the game became something completely unrecognizable. Instead of classic resource gathering and base building, we got a strange mix of RTS and MOBA. Units had to be unlocked through online grinding, the economy was reduced to capturing points, and the strategic depth just ceased to exist. The entire game became unit spam and frontal clashes. There were no creative build orders, no harassment of the economy and some flanking maneuvers, just none of the classic CNC gameplay in general. On top of that, visually the game didn't look much better than its predecessor, the campaign was boring, the story actually failed to resolve major lore arcs, it was just a retcon, and missions were shallow and repetitive, mostly just skirmishes. There was no third faction as it was in the previous game, the screens, and even Kane himself just seemed like he was trying to escape from this game, that's how bad it was. On top of that, you needed a constant internet connection even for single player, which was not a great feature for 2010. So to put it simply, players just hated everything about it. It was worse than the previous games, and at the same time it was so different that people just didn't feel that it was the righteous sequel. The failure of CNC4 was catastrophic. So catastrophic that EA actually abandoned the entire franchise afterwards, and Generals 2 was also cancelled in some way because of how badly CNC4 performed. The scale of that disaster was just unbelievable. And that's it from me. What other big budget RTS failures would you add to this list? Thank you for watching, and check out our videos on CNC Generals and the coolest RTS units of all time. If you really enjoy our content, you can also support us with channel membership. Thank you, have a good day, and see you next time.